I'm so pleased to be here today to introduce the keynote address by the winner of the 2022 Neustadt International Prize for Literature. Born in Dakar in 1946, Boubacar Boris Diop is a luminary in world literature and a significant senior presence among African writers. With a lifelong commitment to literature and education, he taught literature and philosophy in several Senegalese high schools before becoming a writer. Starting in 1991, he was an advisor to the Cultural Ministry in Senegal, and he has worked as a journalist, most notably for a magazine in Switzerland and a newspaper in France. The author of numerous plays and novels, he is best known for his novel Murambi, The Book of Bones, the fictional account of a notorious massacre during the 1994 Rwandan genocide. Also the founder of Soul, an independent newspaper in Senegal, he is the author of many novels, essays, political works, stage plays, and screenplays. During his lifetime, Mr. Diop has come face to face with moments of chilling horror and overwhelming sadness, and he has chosen to be the voice of truth and reconciliation, a courageous voice speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves. With his own brand of political savvy, literary originality, and timeliness, he brings a special sense of honor and urgency to the Neustadt International Prize for Literature. Public intellectual, novelist, playwright, and essayist, Mr. Diop combines elements that mark him as a major literary voice in the 21st century. Please give a warm Oklahoma welcome to Boubacar Boris Diop.
Merci, Robert. Thank you very much. Hi. Okay. Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon, everyone. So that's a great moment for me, And yeah, I'm a bit intimidated. So good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. My special thanks go to the Neustadt family, to Robert and Daniel, and to all the people who work so hard behind the scenes to make this important event possible. So today I have been asked to talk about myself, which is never easy, but I will try to do my best. And to be frank, I'm happy and even proud to have to share with you a part of my literary journey. So I will start in an unusual way. I will start by a story I heard many times when I was a kid. In that particular story, we have an orphan, a young girl, named Yumane. I love that name, Yumane. I love it so much that I'm not quite sure if I haven't invented myself. In fact, I was never passively listening to my mother storyteller. My strong reactions to what she was saying were an integral part of the unfolding of her story. So I'm going to tell you the story of Yumane. Her mother had forbidden her from going to the nocturnal tam-tam sessions. But the tam-tam's calling made her lose her mind. Every night, she would secretly go there when the soil had turn cold, as my mother solitaire would beautifully say. Yet, Humane wasn't aware of something. She wasn't aware that she was the only human being in a congregation of supernatural creatures. We call them in Wolof the jinne. She fell in love with a young man. We are in a tale, and this young man was beautiful, of course. And what was the most dreaded ended up happening. In fact, she became pregnant. So, how to talk about a torrid sexual relationship between Humane and this young man? How to talk of that, about that to children who were 8 or 9 years old? So, yeah, it's a problem, you know. So I can still remember with a smile the narrative creativity of the storyteller. This is what she did. Every night she would say, a strong wind lifted Humane's dress on her way back home. That was it, only that. But after getting struck by the wind several times, which in fact were strikes of another kind, she became pregnant. So what happened next after she became pregnant? Whether Humane was punished by her mother or whether her child became a great king, kind of Alexander the Great, I had no idea at all. And to tell you the truth, it was because I wasn't really interested in finding out. Yeah, I didn't care, in fact. I can only remember the might with which my heart was beating when I imagined Humane in the midst of the jinne with their distorted or worse triangular faces, ready to drink her blood at any moment. The fact is that out of the hundreds of stories I had heard in my early childhood, only vague impressions have remained. For example, the image of night blue or gray colors, like in a painting, and in the abyss of twisted forms, vulnerable human beings having to face running elements. And in fact, those frightened beings were often young women, like in the tale Nyantanta, which impressed me so much when I was a kid that I believe I have included in every one of my novels in one form or another. What I quickly learned with these stories is the extent to which what happens in a story, in a book, its content, to put it briefly, remains always perfectly accessory. That's not important. That's the way I see literature. For me, one can very well stop reading a novel before even reaching its final page, after a good provision of narrative flashes. So every time someone asks me to sum up Anna Karenina or or the great fiction, I do my best, but can't stop thinking that they don't know what writing is actually about. I think a great book, you can't just sum it up, yeah. In effect, tales could only be narrated at night. It made more truthful and worrisome the supernatural world that I became familiar with. Way before my reading of Ahmadu Kuruma from Ivory Coast or Amos Sutwola from Nigeria, and later Latin American authors from Juan Rulfo, the Mexican, to Cortázar, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or Ernesto Sabato, the latter being one of my favorite authors, Ernesto Sabato from Argentina. In other words, I wasn't really impressed by magical realism. In Macondo, I was on familiar ground. For me, there was nothing new. I know it may sound paradoxical, but those oral tales of my childhood have been my best writing workshop. Even before French school initiated me to the mystery of the alphabet. The aura of those beautiful stories was primarily the result of a sort of, yeah, that's a very important word for me, a sort of impenetrability. The difficulty to understand what's written. The whole of their meaning, these stories, resided in a sort of origin of sound and a power of suggestion that gave them intensity. I strongly believe that had I not got lost in the imaginary maze of my mother's storyteller, that I wouldn't later have experienced such a great pleasure in reading and rereading over and over again fully esoteric texts. In fact, I had never felt dismayed for not being able to access the message of an author. And I don't like at all this word, the message. It's an horrible one. I think an author has not a message. You just tell a story. And sometimes you just don't know why you are telling this story. The truth is, most texts have been and are still a delight to me by their soul vibration and because they twirled, so to speak, in all directions. When you think that this is a meaning, in fact, that's not true. That's another meaning. And so that's very interesting to, this game. And it is not surprising that I choose to make Khadija the heroine of my third novel, The Knight and His Shadow, a wonderful storyteller, a storyteller hors pair. A few years before hearing those tales in the town of Thiès, near Dakar, the district of Medina, the district in Dakar, where I was born. I wasn't born in Thiès. The district of Medina had been my school of life, or my street school, as we lived in the street by lack of choice. Our houses were too small, we were too poor, so everybody was living in the street. It is only now, in retrospect, that I realize what a filthy poor slum it was. like we see today in certain bordering zone of the city of Dakar. As a teenager, I didn't see the misery of the place, but instead its glorious modernity, which was back then at the origin of all new trends. Medina was the source of all innovations. Will I say social innovation? Yeah, that's it, I think, yeah. In Domigolo, in my novel Domigolo, Medina is called Nyarela. There, the most brilliant minds would meet, doctors and lawyers, artists and athletes, particularly those who are still seen as Senegalese soccer and basketball legend. Medina was close to the European district of Plateau, to which it constantly measured itself, although this was during the colonial time. In between was built in Rebus, the biggest prison in the country, which is still there, by the way, and which was frequently visited by some our elders, quick at defying the law, especially the laws of the Tubab, of the white colonizer. Tubab means white in Wolof. One of them was Yadikon, a kind of Robin Hood, immortalized by the great filmmaker Djibril Diop Mambeti. Medina was also, naturally, the stage of epic political confrontations between the Red Party of Lamine Guèye's SFIO, it was the name of his party, and the Green Party of the poet Léopold Sédar Senghor. Senghor was more progressive, or maybe I should say less reactionary than his then socialist rival, Lamine Guèye, who anecdotically was my maternal great-uncle. Senghor ultimately became the father of independence of Senegal and its first president. The country could have found maybe someone better, but that is another story. I don't want to talk about that, yeah. Medina is also where a few friends and I have created a cultural club called simply Culture et Loisir Club, Culture and Leisure Club in English. I was one of its founders with the Bey twins, Hassan and Husseinu. Ben Jogai Bey was there, and Ben Jogai Bey became a renowned filmmaker. The late Hassan Prera, and finally Boubacar Mbow, the master of the village of Ndem, as known as Shaka, who today is a respected figure of Muhidia spirituality. Near the area of the Corniche, we had a cine club where we analyzed for hours and hours the very first African film, all short features, except maybe Black Girl by Semen Ousmane. Semen Ousmane we call the father of African cinema. And Borom Saret, yeah, his first movie, a very short one. This movie has several times been at the center of our debates. So there was also Afrique sur scène by Paulin Soumanou Vieira, Sarzan by Montmarcham, and one of our favorites, Et la neige n'était plus, by Boubacar Samb Maharam. Nonetheless, our most common activities revolve around books. While I discovered there La Plaie, the novel La Plaie by Malik Fall, God's Bit of Wood by Semen Ousmane, Ambiguous Adventure by Cheikh Hamidou Kane, or Kokumbo, l'étudiant noir by Akeloba, our choice of reading went far beyond Africa's borders. In our sometimes stormy reading sessions, we read L'étranger by Albert Camus or another French classic. And I remember that Grégoire Samsa's name, the main character of The Metamorphosis by Kafka, would often come in our jokes. I remember also that one of us, Ousseynou Bey, who is today one of my best friends, loved to repeat what Chen says in The Man's Fate, La Condition Humaine by André Malraux. Chen says, luckily we can act. It's a chance that human being can do something. Luckily we can act. That's what Chen says. And my friend, he liked to, my friend Ousseynou, he liked to repeat that. Yeah, we would also organize discussion about economy and politics. And I would later find out that our early taste for politics had attracted the attention of an underground communist movement that would regularly send up their recruiter. To top it all, we had created a journal titled Le Bourgeon. I had myself found the title is in an article by the poet David Mandessi Diop. David Mandessi Diop, who died in a crash plane at the age of 33 off the coast of Dakar. Yeah, a great poet. And he said in an article, he gave his definition of literature in an article. So I read it at that time, and this is what he wrote. Literature is the expression of a moving reality. It begins where reality starts, captures it, says it while it is just a bud, and helps it grow. La littérature est l'expression d'une réalité en mouvement. Elle part de la réalité, la capte, saisit ce qui n'est que bourgeon et l'aide à mûrir. Thinking back, I'm really stunned that we were able to do so much at such a young age. So it is nonetheless not surprising that I wrote my first novel entitled La Cloison. In English, it would be The Fence, when I was about 16. I had already read so much. It was handwritten, of course, and I was a shy teenager and with a severe stutter. I couldn't speak normally. In the novel, La Cloison, The Fence, I wrote about a Senegalese middle schooler, Kader Cissé, and his French class fellow, Lucien Gerset. They were both of a modest condition, and they attended the same school, it was Lycée Van Vollenhoven, where there was a majority of white students, and where I felt myself discriminated by the teachers, especially by a certain Monsieur Nègre. That was a real name. He was racist, but his name was Mr. Negro. Yeah. That's true. La cloison. Okay, was, yeah, I try to denounce racism, and there was a very, very naive epi-hand in which the fence, symbol of the division between two races, spectacularly caught fire. And the two young men, Kader and Lucien, were reconciled forever. The black boy and the white boy. I didn't write more than, I didn't write a novel of more than 200 pages, just like that. Yeah, without knowing where I was going. In fact, in my mind, I had to be published, like everybody, you know. I was just 16, but I thought I was good and I have to be published, like Semen Ousmane, like Cheikh Hamidou Khan. So why not? So I sent from Dakar. I sent the book. I had to do it by mail to Présence Africaine in Paris. And they read it, and they sent me a standard letter of rejection, signed by a certain Jacques Ouellette. That name, in fact, is the only thing I remember now from this failed initial publishing experience. Jacques Ouellette, yeah. Very, very, and it was a great name. Anyway, my book was not good. That's normal, yeah. He said, it's beautiful, but we can't publish it. Very quickly after this came the time when at University Cheikh Anta Diop, we had to cover the Marxist classic. And every one of us had to clearly choose between Mao Zedong, Tito, Stalin, Trotsky, and even, believe it or not, much later, the Albanian Enver Hoxha. Some variation of Marxist-Leninism. You have to choose your champion. It can be Mao, Trotsky, Enver Hoxha. But it didn't prevent us from reading Cheikh Anta Diop, Frantz Fanon, Mongo Betty, Amilcar Cabral, and Aimé Césaire. On the contrary, all these writers well complemented each other. There is a lot that could be said about that period, including with regards to a Frantz Fanon club. We found it in Dakar, in a district where my mother had moved to. In fact, it was found in our house. The most important for me during those years was the time I spent reading books alone. The American Cultural Center gave me the opportunity to read and reread all John Steinbeck. I did that. But also some novelists, American novelists, like Erskine Caldwell. I read also someone much more important, Faulkner, I remember, especially Light in August, Richard Wright's Native Son. At the French Cultural Center, I discovered and read all Jean-Paul Sartre fiction, I wrote everything Sartre, I read, everything Sartre wrote, except, of course, his monumental and cryptic philosophical books, L'être et le néant, La critique de la raison dialectique. Just I couldn't understand that. But I read, really, Jean-Paul Sartre. And in fact, I end up declaring myself existentialist at a time when everybody was Marxist-Leninist. And if my middle name is Boris, it's because in one of Jean-Paul Sartre's books, The Road to Freedom, Les Chemins de la Liberté, I think in the two first volumes, there is a very important, interesting character, Boris Sergin. He was a kind of libertarian, a kind of anarchist, and really he was my model. And I kept talking about Boris Sergin. And my friends, they said, you are Boris. And now I'm not Boubacar Diop. That's what's in my passport. If I'm Boubacar Boris Diop, it's because I read Jean-Paul Sartre, when I was young. Now, like everybody else, you know it, I was very fond of Latin American literature, to the point of writing in my first published novel, Le Temps de Tamango, that 100 years of solitude is the absolute masterpiece of universal literature. That's what I wrote. 100 years of solitude is the absolute masterpiece of universal literature. So this was the enthusiasm of youth. But I think it certainly shows that, I was really struck by Garcia Marquez's novel. I'm not the only one. I still think that it's a great book, but now, I'm sure I won't say that it's the absolute masterpiece of anything. So reading all these books and being engaged in all these activities, often at a very early age, that was just the normal itinerary of what we call a Francophone writer. That's a very important part of my journey as a writer. I have been, and I said it before, I was really involved in that. I was a normal Francophone writer. A classic one. But in 1998, everything changed. And I'm going now to explain why. 1998 is the year when I went to Rwanda for the first time with a group of writers from different African countries, to assess the extent of damage caused by the genocide against the Tutsi. The organizer, they asked us to provide a fictional testimony of our experience. But, and that's really the most important thing, but only if we wanted to. You weren't obliged to write. Go, see what you have to see, and if you feel like, you write. But if you don't want to write, you just don't do it. it was a moral contract. That was the most, and if I accept really to go, maybe it was because of that. I wasn't obliged to write. It was an exceptional initiative, writers going on the terrain, to put it that way. And it was called, I said it earlier, Rwanda, writing as a duty of memory. This experience in Rwanda has gradually led me to put the genocide against the Tutsi at the center of my personal reflection, and to give a greater importance to my mother tongue in my creative writing. In sum, to convey in Wolof a genocide which had completely turned my mental sphere upside down. The Night and Its Shadow, which I just mentioned, is my first book which deals with the genocide in Rwanda. It had taken place, the genocide had taken place 4 years earlier, and I have to confess it, having never been interested in it, I saw in the genocide, with the typical contempt of the writer of my generation, yet another African disaster. I feel I have to explain what I mean by typical contempt of the writers of my generation. That's what we call Afro-pessimism. You have on one end the racism, foreigners saying Africa, shithole countries. Yes, but you have Africans saying that. That's what's interesting. And this is Africa denigrating Africa and Africans. That's called Afro-pessimism. And it's something you see everywhere in Africa. We have to think about it. That's why when there's a genocide in Rwanda, you just go, that's not so important. That's Africa. That's how we are. That's what I call the typical contempt of our generation for Africa. So when the genocide happened, we didn't think that it was something, it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a big deal. It was very sad. But okay, let's forget about it. So, yes, yet another African tragedy, disaster. I was so ignorant about the real facts that had occurred between April and July 94 in Rwanda that, in my book, The Night and Its Shadow, I blurred, the line between the perpetrator and their victim. In fact, the leaders of former Zaire refugee camp, later I would learn it, by reading history books, The leaders of former Zaire refugee camp that I depicted in my novel, the novel Before Murambi, as heroes were in fact the masterminds of the genocide, who had fled from Rwanda after having committed the most atrocities there. And in my book, I say they are heroes because I just didn't know. Kind of innocence, I didn't know. It's Africa, killing each other. That's not a big problem. Okay, you are the heroes, you are the victims, and okay. And the episode, indeed, at least, that's not a very important part of my book. It's a very short part. maybe 3, 4 pages. What I say to Rwanda in The Night and in the Shadow is a very small part. Nonetheless, it was embarrassing, given the historical importance of the genocide. What do I mean by that? The 1994 genocide, it was at least 10,000 people killed every day, for 100 days, and without a single day of respite for the Tutsi, who were butchered with machetes, burned alive, thrown alive in cesspools, or deliberately infected with HIV. That's the genocide in Rwanda. A gigantic disaster had fallen on a small African country, and 4 years later, in 1998, I was reading it upside down. By digging a little bit, I realized that if African tragedies repeat themselves with such a sinister regularity, it is because we don't know how to prevent them, or simply we don't accept to see them while they are destroying entire cities or countries, in fact, in the case of Rwanda. How not to question, if you are an intellectual, how not to question yourself after such a realization. I didn't want myself to let myself trap by the old stereotypes which perceive Africa, Afro-pessimism, I said. Africa has a blood-dirty place where tribes massacre each other almost for no reason, since immemorial time. That is why Murambi, the Book of Bones, is by far my most documented novel. To write it, I read many books and articles, and I watched every movie I could find. I talked to survivors and to the killers in their prisons. A harvest of facts that I insisted on using with a lot of cautiousness had emerged. I, for example, made sure that the realistic description of certain barbaric acts does not incite the reader to see the entire novel as a pure invention. I didn't want the reader to leave his comfort zone and to say, oh, this is a work of imagination. This never happened. I didn't want that. And that's the old question, whether we can write fiction or not about a genocide. Yeah, it was raised here for me, because the question, it would certainly be, who would indeed believe that something like this actually happened? Yeah, if it's too much, people, they just say, no, that's not true. Okay, no, something happened in Rwanda, but this book, not. Oh, and I didn't want that. I wanted people to understand that what I was writing in this book, and that's why, okay, I went to Rwanda more as a journalist than as a writer. I was there collecting facts, and afterwards I read books, I watched movies, before I write it. And that's why any novel about genocide never stops denying, in a way or another, being a novel. It is not a work of imagination. It is the truth. That's what you keep saying to yourself and to your reader when you write a fiction about a genocide. I wrote Murambi, the Book of Bones, while making sure that I always remain one tone below. And it is therefore not a coincidence that it's the most accessible of all my books, from Les Tambours de la Mémoire to Les Traces de la Meute. Writing in the smell of so many dead bodies quickly eliminates the urge for literary complexities. Those signatures, quote unquote, of avant-garde, which I was so keen on before Rwanda, suddenly seemed to so frivolous in front of such human suffering. It's because of similar writing pirouettes that I made praises to the killers who fled to the Congo, as I just said. So I decided it will never happen to me again as a writer. This experience, and the only thing you have to do is to get informed. You don't have to talk about a tragedy just like that without knowing what happened in a particular place. Yeah, it's the first lesson I got from Rwanda. So this experience can make anyone lose their innocence. As beyond literature, and I know that I don't write the same way since Murambi was published. Beyond that, I wanted to understand what had really happened in Rwanda. Really, I know the facts, not the idea, the facts, what happened. I particularly discovered that it was, I'm going to talk about France here. I particularly discovered that it was to promote its language, French language, that the French state, under François Mitterrand, actively and with boundless determination got involved in the genocide in Rwanda, alongside killers of elderly and newborn babies. This has been denied for a long time with indignation by the French elite in Paris. Oh no, Africans, they kill each other. And then they say, oh yeah, you French, you Italian, you American, they don't want to take responsibility for what they have done. So it was denied. But this complicity is now so widely documented that it's recognized by everybody, including by the French public opinion. It took, almost 20 years before the public opinion in France accepted. Just last year, a report has been published by 13 French scholars, historians, anthropologists, all these, political scientists. It's called the report du Clair. And it's clear. I read it, 1,000 pages. I read it on my screen. it was very difficult, but I read it, and I wrote an article, a very long article, yeah, about these Duclerc report. And that's not Africans who are saying that French did bad things in Rwanda. French scholars, after having investigated during 2 or 3 years, they said, yeah, it's true. And they used official archives of Élysée Palace, of the Quai d'Orsay. They did a good job. And that's why Emmanuel Macron went to Rwanda to say sorry. Yeah, you have some responsibility. Now it's clear. But at the time, it was impossible. People they didn't want in France, they didn't want here. Now it's clear for everybody. As for me, until my stay in Rwanda, I had criticized imperialism, neocolonialism. Since I had read classical Marxist books, Marx, Lenin, Mao Zedong, but I had also read Frantz Fanon, Nkrumah, Anta Diop. So they had taught me to despise imperialism and neocolonialism, and to criticize these systems of domination. But it was quite abstract, to be frank, in my mind. It came just from books. Now the difference with Rwanda is that the dead of Rwanda, they had brought to my reflection the white of their blood. In fact, it pushed me to rather analyze the domination which former French colonies are victim of 6 years after independence, and which is well summed in the neologism France, Afrique. A term was coined by François-Xavier Verschave. Beyond the book, Negrophobia, which I co-authored with in 2005 with the same Verschave and Odile Tobner, I have never stopped denouncing this France-Afrique, this system of economic mafia type and archaic destruction, in fact, not only pillage, destruction of Africa, of some African countries. Yeah, in fact, the former French colonies, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Cameroon, Gabon, Chad, you name it. And all of that allow me to better understand why France was investing so much money and energy on the African continent to defend its language. And yet, I, as a writer, I had chosen French as a communicative, as my tool to write my fiction. So I realized my involvement in an extroverted African literature, written in colonial languages, and I quote here David Mandesi Diop, and quote, end quote, historically condemned. African literature written in Portuguese, in French, in English. David Diop says, and that's in fact what also said Anta Diop and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, it is, these two words, historically condemned. So apart from Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Anta Diop, I can quote John Coetzee, the South African Nobel Prize laureate, who is not a militant writer, but he said something so extraordinary that the first day I read it, really, I started respecting much more. This is what he writes in Elizabeth Costello. I think that's the first thing he published after the Nobel Prize. The main character, it's a collection of short stories, but they are interconnected. And the main character, keeps coming back in every story. And it's Elizabeth Costello. And this is what Elizabeth Costello says to Emmanuel Edougou. Emmanuel Edougou, who is a Nigerian writer. That's very powerful, in fact. So she said to Edougou, the English novel is written in the first place by English people for English people. The Russian novel is written by Russians for Russians. But the African novel is not written by Africans for Africans. African novelists, still Coetzee speaking, African novelists may write about Africa, about African experience, but they are glancing every time over their shoulder as they write at the foreigners who will read them. Whether they like it or not, they have assumed the role of interpreter, interpreting Africa to the world. Yet, how can you explore a world in all its depths if at the same time you are having to explain it to outsiders? I think, end of the quotation. I think that's very, very important. And my desire to write, I'm nearing the end of my presentation. My desire to write in Wolof has always been there, somewhat scattered and uncontrolled, but it was part of my cycle of reflection. It was triggered by a wish to better understand the genocide against the Tutsi, which are ultimately pushed me to take action. To take action, I mean to write in Wolof. That was the beginning of all. Here, I wanted to bring back Humane and my mother storyteller. The latter had never set foot in a classroom, in a French classroom. So it was in Wolof that she described to me the love story between Humane and the storm. Without even knowing, she was preparing me for literary creation in my mother tongue. That's why I end up writing in Wolof. I start writing in French, I guess, because of my father's library. But if I could write in Wolof, it was because of the oral tales of my mother. Switching from one language to another, from French to Wolof, I think it would deserve, much more time, but yeah, we can just talk about here. I would simply say that I hope to my 3 novels, Domigolo, Bamelu Koch Barma, and Melanum Lundum, as well as a translation of Césaire's Season in the Congo, an immense joy, which I had never experienced when I was writing in French. This process of self-reconnection, which is eminently political, that's clear, is not limited to creative writing. We have, my friends and I created Edjo, a publishing house in African language. And it is not by coincidence that we choose to call it Ejo. Ejo, it's a word in Kinyarwanda. The connection between my mother tongue and the genocide, the Tutsi genocide, I think I wanted to make it clear there. The editorial board also teaches Wolof of Edjo, and we have created defuwahu.com, which is to this day the only online journal in Wolof of Senegal. To this day. So, being born in Dakar and coming back from Thiès several years later, my mother's town, as much as my father's library, because in the same house, I had the storyteller in the night, and I have my father's library in the day, during the day. I have often talked about it, by the way. Yeah, they have had an enormous impact on my intellectual development. I was able, without much effort, to get rid of my Francograph writer destiny. Why do I say that I'm a Francograph and not a Francophone writer? Francophone, it means you speak French. No, in Senegal, I never speak French. I speak Wolof. Even when I was just writing in French. So I'm Francograph. It means I write in French, but French is not the language I speak in my daily life. And nobody speaks French in Senegal. So I could just shift, and I could express in my mother tongue, Wolof, the dreams and the sufferings of the Rwandan people. The Rwandan people, the Senegalese people, but also of all human beings. Thank you for your attention.